Steam rose from the tin trays like ghosts of home. The Japanese prisoners sat frozen, their hands hovering over forks and knives they had not been trusted with in months. Outside the wooden barrack, the Kansas wind swept across the wheat fields, rattling the fences where barbed wire caught the late autumn sun. It was November 1945. Inside, the smell was unmistakable: roasted turkey, buttered corn, pumpkin pie. One of the men whispered, "This is a trick." Another shook his head, unable to breathe as an American farmer, sleeves rolled up, smiled and said, "Eat up, boys. It's Thanksgiving." For a moment, no one moved. The memory of hunger from the Pacific jungles clashed violently with this vision of abundance. They had been told Americans were devils, yet here devils had cooked them dinner. And as they lifted the first forkful of turkey to their lips, a truth began to gnaw at everything they thought they knew about war and about mercy. Weeks before that meal, the train carrying the prisoners rolled through an ocean of gold and silence. The Kansas plains stretched endlessly beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow sound itself. For men who had fought in jungles thick with death, the emptiness was unbearable. They pressed their faces to the barred windows, searching for signs of menace, guard towers, dogs, the gray geometry of punishment, but saw instead rows of wheat bending in the wind and barns painted the color of earth. When the train finally hissed to a stop, no one spoke. The Americans waiting on the platform stood at ease, their rifles slung not as threats but as tools. One man, broad-shouldered and sunburned, lifted a clipboard and said a few English words none of the prisoners understood. But his tone carried no hatred, only routine. That, more than anything, unnerved them. Routine belonged to a world they had destroyed. They were marched through the camp gates expecting humiliation, perhaps even execution. Instead, they found rows of clean barracks, smoke rising from chimneys, and a yard swept of dust. The air smelled faintly of hay and soap. A sign above the gate bore only a number, not a slogan. The guards, younger than most of the prisoners, moved with the calm of men who had long ceased to hate their enemy. Some nodded curtly as they passed. The gesture was small but devastating. It recognized them as human. Inside the barracks, bunks stood in neat order, blankets folded, a stove glowing at the center. One prisoner whispered, "It is a trap." Another muttered that perhaps the Americans fattened them for labor. Yet, when bowls of stew appeared that evening, thick with meat, steaming in the chill air, their hunger betrayed their fear. They ate in silence, waiting for cruelty that never came. In the days that followed, the prisoners learned the rhythm of the camp. Morning roll call beneath skies so clear they hurt the eyes, breakfast in mess halls that smelled of coffee, then work assignments carried out beyond the fences. The shock was constant. They had expected stone walls. Instead, they found horizons. They had braced for shouts. They received instructions spoken with patience. Even the guards' laughter, low and unguarded, struck them as a kind of heresy. To laugh was to forget war. To forget war was to forget duty. Yet each passing day chipped at the armor of fear that had once defined their survival. Among them was a former corporal named Harada, who had fought on Luzon and seen comrades die with honor rather than yield. The first time he saw an American farmer drive a tractor past the fence, he felt something twist inside him. The machine gleamed like a relic of a future Japan had been promised, but never reached. Later that week, Harada and others were taken outside the wire to repair irrigation ditches. They worked under the eyes of the farmers themselves, men with rough hands and easy voices who offered canteens of water when the sun grew fierce. No guard barked orders, no whip cracked. only the slow, relentless rhythm of labor. Harada looked up once to find a boy, perhaps 10 years old, standing at the edge of a field, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The boy waved. Harada hesitated, then lifted a hand in return. That moment, brief as breath, unsettled him more than any interrogation could have. At night, the barracks filled with whispers. Some men confessed they had begun to sleep without nightmares. Others dreamed of home, of rice fields and mothers' voices. A few refused to speak at all, clinging to the fragments of pride left to them. "We are not guests," one hissed. "Do not forget." But even he ate the bread, drank the coffee, and stared at the guards with reluctant gratitude. The cruelty they had prepared for never came. Instead came routine, and in that routine a strange dignity. They were prisoners, yes, but the walls were invisible, made not of stone or wire, but of memory and disbelief. Each sunrise over the Kansas plains dissolved a little more of both. And though none could yet name it, the transformation had begun, not through defeat, but through the quiet, disarming mercy of order. When the orders came for field work, the men expected humiliation disguised as labor. They imagined chains, barked commands, and rifles shadowing their every move. Instead, they were herded not toward mines or quarries, but toward open farmland that rolled to the horizon like a sea of gold. The air was thick with the scent of soil and wheat. A few farmers waited by their tractors, hands on hips, watching the line of prisoners approach. They looked not like soldiers, but like men carved by weather and patience. One of them, a wiry old man with sun-browned skin, gestured toward the fields and said a single word: "Work." There was no sneer, no cruelty, only expectation. And so, beneath the vast American sky, men who had once screamed battle cries for an emperor began to harvest wheat for their former enemies. The work was punishing. But it was also strangely liberating. The soil clung to their fingers, warm and real in a way war never had been. Sweat streaked their backs as they bent to cut and bind, their movements guided by habit rather than command. For years they had labored under fear of superiors, of starvation, of dishonor. Here, under the sun, there was only the rhythm of work and the steady hum of wind through the crops. They did not understand the farmers' language, but they understood the unspoken code of labor. Do your part, and the day will pass cleanly. The guards, leaning lazily against fence posts, smoked cigarettes and barely watched. Such trust was unthinkable. Harada, the former corporal, felt something inside him soften and resist all at once. Freedom and shame had become impossible to tell apart. At noon, the prisoners rested in the shade of a barn. The farmers' wives arrived in pickup trucks, carrying baskets wrapped in cloth. From them came the smell of bread and apples, of coffee freshly poured. The women set the baskets down, nodded briefly, and left without a word. The guards motioned for the prisoners to eat. Some hesitated, convinced this was some strange American test. Others, driven by hunger, reached first. The bread was soft, real wheat, not the coarse rations of rice husk they had known. The coffee was bitter and strong, its taste unfamiliar but intoxicating. Harada took one cautious sip and felt heat rush through his chest. He looked around at the others, watching them chew in silence, faces rigid with disbelief. A man beside him muttered that these were tricks meant to weaken their spirit. Yet the next morning, that same man volunteered for field duty again. The days followed one another, marked by labor and by the quiet acts that dismantled certainty. A farmer handed a canteen to a prisoner without hesitation. Another allowed them to rest beneath a tree on his property, pointing out a patch of shade as though speaking to equals. Each gesture seemed small, but together they built something dangerous: doubt. How could these men, whom propaganda had painted as beasts, offer such simple humanity? Harada thought of the officers back in Luzon who had struck him for collapsing under heat. He thought of the civilians who had cheered men into death because surrender was forbidden. And now, here, he was handed food and water by the supposed enemy. His mind reeled under the weight of contradiction. At night, lying on his bunk, Harada turned the day's images over in his mind: the woman's steady eyes, the farmer's quiet nod, the taste of coffee that still lingered on his tongue. The Bushido code whispered that honor came through suffering, that mercy was weakness. Yet under this foreign sky, those words began to sound hollow. Perhaps, he thought, dignity could be found not only in death, but in the work of living. Around him, other men stirred restlessly, caught in the same unspoken turmoil. One finally said, "They work like us, they eat like us, so why did we fight them?" No one answered. The question hung in the darkness, heavy as the scent of earth after rain. And when dawn broke again, painting the fields in gold, the prisoners rose not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous to an empire built on obedience: curiosity. It was curiosity that replaced fear, that dared to whisper questions where silence had once ruled. Yet, by late November, that curiosity turned uneasy when the first rumors began to drift through the camp, softly at first, like smoke rising from unseen fires. The Americans, some said, were planning a feast, a celebration called Thanksgiving. The word meant nothing to most of the Japanese prisoners. To them, any holiday of the victors sounded like mockery. "A trick," one man spat. "They will make us serve them their meal." Others nodded grimly. They had learned to expect cruelty in forms that began with kindness. So they waited, wary and watchful, as the Kansas wind grew colder and the sky turned the color of steel. The first sign came in the form of wooden crates unloaded near the kitchen barrack. They were marked with words none could read, but the pictures, turkeys, pumpkins, corn, spoke a language older than war. Some of the guards joked among themselves, slapping the sides of the crates as if sharing a secret. When one box cracked open, the air filled with a sweet, earthy scent that sent the prisoners reeling. Vegetables, fresh, whole. The sight alone felt indecent. Back home, the men's families were rumored to be starving. In the jungles of Luzon and the tunnels of Okinawa, they had eaten roots, insects, sometimes even the flesh of their fallen brothers. And now their enemy stacked food high enough to feed an army. The paradox gnawed at them. By the next day, the camp buzzed with contradiction, laughter mixed with tension, disbelief with longing. Some of the younger prisoners whispered that maybe the Americans wanted to show off their wealth, to remind them what defeat truly meant. Others, quieter and older, said nothing. Harada watched as the camp cook, a red-faced man from Missouri known for humming songs about rivers, began unloading flour sacks and spices. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the yard, faint but undeniable. The smell triggered memories he didn't want. His mother roasting chestnuts on a small charcoal stove in winter, his sister's laughter before the bombs fell. He turned away sharply, ashamed of the sudden ache. When the cook asked for volunteers to help prepare the food, no one moved. The interpreter repeated the request in halting Japanese. "He needs hands for cooking." Still, the men froze. It was unthinkable to serve the enemy's table, to wear an apron instead of a uniform. The silence stretched until one young private, no older than 20, stepped forward. "I can cut vegetables," he said softly. The guards nodded approval. A few others followed, driven by hunger or curiosity, none sure which. The cook handed them aprons, grinned, and led them inside. Soon the sound of chopping filled the mess hall, joined by the sizzle of fat in pans. That night, the smell spread across the camp like a ghost of peace. The prisoners lay awake, their stomachs churning not from hunger, but from confusion. They could hear laughter from the kitchen, the clatter of trays, the occasional burst of a harmonica. Harada turned on his bunk and whispered, "They are playing with us." A voice in the dark replied, "Then why do they feed us like this?" No one answered. In the morning, the evidence was undeniable. More trucks arrived, bringing milk, butter, and long loaves of bread. The guards unloaded them without ceremony. A strange calm settled over the camp, as if the Americans were preparing not for punishment, but for ritual. For the first time since capture, some of the men smiled, not out of joy, but sheer disbelief. Could mercy exist without reason? Could kindness be real without purpose? And as the sweet smell of roasted turkey began to rise from the kitchen, something inside them began to crack, not in despair, but in the slow, terrifying realization that they might have been wrong, that perhaps the enemy they had been taught to despise was capable of something their own war could never give them: humanity. As the story pauses here, right before the dinner that would change everything, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know what country or city you're in as we share these forgotten chapters of history together. And if you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like the video, hit subscribe just below this player, and tap the notification bell so you'll be the first to see. Thanksgiving morning came quietly, wrapped in the stillness of frost. The sun rose slow and pale, brushing the horizon in faint strokes of gold. Inside the camp, the air held its breath. From the kitchen drifted the smell of roasting meat and buttered bread, rich and impossible to ignore. Men woke early, unsure of what to do with the day. Some polished their boots as if preparing for inspection. Others sat on their bunks, hands folded, waiting for a trick that never came. Then, around mid-morning, a bell rang. Not the harsh clang of command, but a single, gentle chime, an invitation. They filed into the mess hall in silence. The warmth hit first, wrapping them in a soft, humid haze of steam and spice. Tin trays lined the tables, gleaming beneath the light that poured through the frosted windows. Pots of mashed potatoes, bowls of corn, gravy in silver pitchers. All of it was too much to take in. Harada stood near the back, his stomach twisting not from hunger but disbelief. The guards moved among them, setting plates, ladling food, smiling in that awkward way of men trying to bridge a chasm too wide for words. Then, without ceremony, the doors opened and the farmers entered. Ordinary men and women in thick coats and gloves, cheeks pink from the cold. In their hands they carried platters of turkey, golden and glistening with fat. For a moment the room froze. Soldiers and civilians, victors and vanquished, stared at each other across the tables. Then one farmer's wife, gray-haired and gentle-eyed, nodded toward a nearby prisoner and placed the platter in front of him. "Eat," she said softly. The interpreter hesitated, translating only that single word. "Eat." The spell broke. Trays clattered, chairs scraped. The feast began. The first bite was almost unbearable. Warmth spread through Harada's chest as he tasted the turkey, tender, seasoned, impossibly rich. The mashed potatoes melted like clouds. Even the air seemed to hum with flavor. Around him the men ate in silence at first, afraid to appear greedy, then faster as disbelief gave way to need. Some laughed quietly, others wept. A young guard carried a pitcher of milk down the aisle, refilling cups without being asked. The prisoners nodded in thanks, their eyes lowered, their throats too tight to speak. Across the room, a farmer and his teenage son sat beside two prisoners, passing bread back and forth. Neither side shared a language, yet laughter found its way through gestures, clumsy, honest, human. One man folded his napkin into a small crane and placed it on the table. The boy grinned and tried to copy it. The camp cook leaned against the wall, wiping his hands on his apron, watching with quiet satisfaction. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered. But beneath the warmth and the taste and the strange lightness of it all, there was another feeling, one that no one dared to name. Between bites, Harada saw his mother's face, thin and tired, waiting in the ruins of Tokyo for food that would never come. He imagined his younger brother, bones showing through skin, scavenging in the ashes. The sweetness of pumpkin pie turned bitter in his mouth. Around him, others paused too, their eyes distant, their forks motionless. Gratitude collided with guilt, and for a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the wind outside, brushing against the windows like a memory. Then the cook clapped his hands once, and conversation began again, softly at first, then louder, like a thaw. The men ate until the tables were bare. When the last tray was cleared, someone began humming, a hymn, perhaps, or a lullaby. One by one, others joined in. The guards didn't stop them. The farmers smiled, and in that fragile harmony, for a heartbeat, the war felt far away. When the meal ended, the prisoners stood, bowed deeply, and filed out into the cold. The farmers and their wives watched them go, faces unreadable. Harada lingered at the doorway, turning back once to see the empty tables, the crumbs, the traces of warmth. He thought, "They gave us food." But as he stepped into the Kansas wind, he realized they had given something else, something he could not yet name, but would never forget. That night, the barracks were quiet in a way they had never been before. Not with peace, but with a silence that pressed down, heavy and unspoken. The men lay on their bunks, their stomachs full for the first time in months. But the weight inside them was not comfort. It was guilt. Harada stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the wood, listening to the faint creak of wind against the walls. Somewhere, a man began to cry softly, not from pain or punishment, but from something deeper, something he could not explain. For soldiers taught that honor was worth more than life, to feel gratitude toward the enemy was to betray the dead. Outside, the moonlight cut through the frost, painting the snow in pale silver. The camp seemed almost peaceful, yet inside the barracks, the air trembled with conflict. Harada turned on his side and saw Nakamura, the young private who had volunteered in the kitchen, still wearing his borrowed apron, now folded neatly by his pillow. His eyes were open, staring into the dark. "They said we are lucky," Nakamura whispered. "Lucky to be alive." He paused. "But I wish I had not eaten." Harada said nothing. The words hung between them, heavy with shame. How could they eat when their families starved beneath ruins? How could warmth taste so wrong? The next morning the camp moved slowly, as if burdened by memory. Some men avoided looking at the guards. Others returned to the fields, working in silence more rigid than before. The Americans seemed to sense the change, but did not speak of it. A farmer passing by tipped his hat, but no one lifted their gaze. The feast had fed their bodies. Yes, but it had also torn open something far more fragile. The illusion of simplicity was gone. Mercy, they realized, could wound as deeply as hatred. That evening, Harada sat alone near the fence, the cold biting through his coat. He thought of home, the narrow streets of his village, the scent of his mother's miso soup, the laughter of his younger brother before he was drafted. Were they alive? Were they hungry? He would never know. The Red Cross allowed only short messages to be sent, censored and read before leaving the camp. "I am well. Do not worry." Those were the only words permitted. Anything else, any mention of kindness, of meals shared with Americans, would be cut away. Even if he could tell the truth, who would believe it? That the enemy had fed them, smiled at them, treated them as men, not beasts. In Japan, such a story would sound like blasphemy. Later, in the dim barracks, the men began to whisper again. Some argued that the feast was a trap of the spirit, meant to make them forget their duty. "We must remember who we are," said one, pounding his fist against his chest. "We are soldiers of the Emperor. We do not thank the enemy." But another, older prisoner, his voice cracked with age, murmured, "Perhaps the war ended for them before it ended for us." The others fell silent. It was dangerous to think such thoughts, even more dangerous to agree. Harada lay awake long after the lamps were extinguished. The smell of turkey and bread still lingered faintly on his hands, and he rubbed them together as if to wash it away. He could not. Mercy clung like oil, warm, persistent, and impossible to scrub clean. His heart ached with the contradiction of it. He hated the Americans for their kindness, and hated himself more for wanting to understand it. Somewhere in the darkness, Nakamura whispered a prayer to his ancestors, begging forgiveness for eating at the table of the enemy. Others joined softly, their voices trembling like the wind. The prayers rose together, a broken chorus of shame and confusion. Harada did not pray. He simply stared into the dark, the taste of Thanksgiving still haunting his tongue, and wondered whether kindness could be more terrifying than cruelty. For the first time he feared not death, but the unbearable mercy of survival. In the days that followed, that mercy began to take root in ways no one could explain. The camp was quieter, yet the silence no longer carried the same weight. The men moved differently now, still disciplined, still proud, but with something gentler in their stride. When they worked the fields, they did so without the bitterness that once clung to every motion. Even the guards seemed to sense the shift. Orders were given softly, smiles were returned more easily. And though no one spoke of the Thanksgiving feast aloud, its memory lingered like the aftertaste of something sacred, impossible to forget, impossible to name. Harada felt it most in the mornings. The Kansas air bit cold against his face as he joined the others outside the barracks, yet he found himself listening, not just to the wind, but to the rhythm of life beyond the fences, the distant hum of tractors, the bark of a dog, the call of a farmer to his son. It was a simple world, built on repetition and trust, and for the first time he wondered if perhaps strength could exist without war. That thought frightened him, yet it also gave him peace. Over time, small exchanges began to bridge the gulf between captor and captive. A guard named Miller, barely more than a boy, started teaching English words between tasks. He would point to objects and speak slowly. Sky, tree, bread. The prisoners repeated the sounds awkwardly, laughing when they stumbled. Harada, who had once led men into battle, now found himself proud to pronounce "thank you" correctly. One afternoon, Miller handed him a small scrap of paper with a drawing of a turkey on it, crudely sketched in pencil. "Souvenir," he said, grinning. Harada bowed in thanks, the word now carrying the full weight of sincerity. The farmers noticed the change, too. When they came by to collect the work crews, they began leaving small gifts, an apple, a newspaper, sometimes a piece of cloth. The men, in turn, began crafting tiny origami figures from the pages of old letters, folding cranes, foxes, and stars with delicate precision. The first time a farmer's daughter received one, a paper crane with her name written in careful Japanese, she smiled and pinned it to her coat. The sight struck Harada with a strange ache. Here was beauty made by hands that once built bombs. Here was forgiveness exchanged without words. Art began to spread quietly through the camp. On scraps of ration paper and torn burlap, men drew what they saw: endless fields, barns under sunset, the silhouettes of guards walking along fences. One man, a former teacher, began writing poetry in his notebook. His verses spoke of wheat fields and sky, of hands once trained to kill, now learning to plant. Others gathered to listen as he read in low tones after dark. The poems made them uneasy, but they could not stop listening. The words gave form to something they all felt, but could not yet name: the fragile, blooming awareness that they were still human. Propaganda, that old invisible chain, began to rust inside them. The stories they had been fed, of American brutality, of soulless enemies, crumbled beneath the evidence of daily kindness. Each smile, each shared word, was an act of quiet rebellion against what they had once believed. Harada remembered the posters in Tokyo that called Americans beasts, and the speeches that praised death as the only path to honor. Yet here, in Kansas, he was learning that survival could be its own kind of courage. He had seen death in every form, but he had never seen compassion used as power. One evening, as the sun bled over the plains, Harada stood by the fence and watched the farmers finish their day's work. He saw them wipe their hands, remove their hats, and head home to waiting families. He envied them, not for victory, but for normalcy. The war seemed far away now, unreal against the glow of the horizon. Behind him, laughter rippled from the barracks, low, tired, but genuine. For the first time since capture, it didn't sound like defiance or madness. It sounded like life. And as the stars rose above the camp, Harada realized that something had changed forever. The feast had filled their stomachs. Yes, but what truly nourished them was this: the slow, stubborn return of humanity. The seeds had been planted not in the soil of Kansas, but in the fragile soil of their hearts. And though the war still raged in memory, something inside each man had quietly begun to grow toward the light. Winter came like a whisper across the plains. Frost formed on the barrack windows, and the air turned brittle enough to break. The fields lay bare now, the wheat long harvested, the ground resting beneath a thin veil of snow. With work slowing and the days growing shorter, the prisoners had more time to think, and that was dangerous. Reflection had a way of opening old wounds, of stirring questions they had buried beneath duty and pride. It was during those long, quiet evenings that the Red Cross arrived, bringing paper, envelopes, and news. The guards read an announcement aloud. Prisoners were permitted to write home. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a few stepped forward to claim the blank pages, holding them as though they were relics. Harada sat at his bunk, staring at the sheet before him. The lines looked too white, too clean. What could he write? "I am alive." That was all that was expected. Anything beyond that would be read, cut, or blacked out before it left the camp. Yet the words inside him begged for more. He wanted to tell his mother that he had eaten turkey, that he had felt warmth again, that the men they called monsters had treated him with respect. But how could he write that when his homeland still burned, when his people starved and bowed before ashes? To tell such truth might sound like betrayal. Still, silence felt worse. Around the barracks, the scratching of pencils filled the air. Some wrote mechanically, repeating the same censored phrases. Others dared to say more, hiding sincerity between simple words. Nakamura, sitting across from Harada, smiled faintly as he wrote. "What are you telling them?" Harada asked. Nakamura shrugged. "That I am healthy," he said, then added after a pause, "and that the Americans are not as we thought." He folded his letter carefully, sealing it with trembling hands. "Maybe they will never read it," he whispered, "but someone should know." Days later, the letters were collected. The guards handled them gently, stacking them into sacks marked with the Red Cross emblem. None of the men knew which messages would survive the journey across the ocean, through censors and storms, into the hands of their families. Yet hope, fragile and foolish, stirred among them. They had lived too long in silence. Now their voices, even if cut to ribbons, might still echo somewhere beyond the wire. Weeks passed before the first faint replies arrived. The letters were few, worn thin from travel. One was passed to Harada from a guard who nodded kindly. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The writing was faint, rushed, but the words struck deep. "Your father is gone. Your mother prays every day. She cannot believe you live." Nothing more. Yet beneath the grief, Harada thought he saw something else, a kind of disbelief not at his survival, but at the tone of his own letter. He had written of mercy, of meals, of laughter. To a mother who had known only hunger and propaganda, such words must have sounded like madness. Elsewhere, a few letters slipped through uncensored, finding their way into the hands of Japanese families who read them in secret. They spoke of turkey, of pumpkin pie, of the strange kindness of American guards. "They gave us food," one prisoner had written. "They call it Thanksgiving." Those who read it whispered the words again and again, as if repeating them might make them real. Some wept, others grew angry, accusing the writer of weakness or delusion. Yet the seed had been planted. Even in a land still echoing with air raids and ration lines, a quiet question took root. What if the enemy was not what we were told? Across the Pacific, that question traveled faster than any ship. It passed through conversations in burned-out villages between wives, mothers, and sons. It became rumor, then memory, then myth. In time, those whispers would outlive the war itself. But for now, in the frozen heart of Kansas, the prisoners waited for spring, unaware that their letters, fragile as paper, had already begun to reshape how a nation would remember its enemy. Snow came suddenly, erasing the fields in a single night. By morning, the camp was a landscape of white silence. The fences looked softer beneath their frozen coats, the guard towers like watchful trees dusted with sugar. Harada stood at the window of the barrack, breath fogging the glass, and thought it strange that a prison could look this peaceful. The war had begun to feel far away, too far, perhaps. Months had passed without news of battles, without shouts or bombs, or orders barked in fear. The men awoke, worked, and slept in a rhythm that had grown almost gentle. It was a kind of freedom they had never known, though it existed inside barbed wire, and that, more than anything, unsettled them. In the evenings, they built small decorations from scraps, paper stars, folded cranes, bits of wood carved into tiny trees. Some hung them near the stove, others tucked them beneath pillows as charms. A few guards helped quietly, pretending not to notice when prisoners sang the songs they had learned from them. Old American tunes hummed softly in broken rhythm. Laughter echoed through the barracks on those nights, brittle but real, rising above the whine of the Kansas wind. The guards, hearing it, exchanged glances but said nothing. They had long since stopped seeing the men as enemies. They were farmhands, musicians, poets, survivors, men who belonged as much to this soil as to the homeland that had abandoned them. Harada began teaching one of the guards to fold paper cranes, showing him the delicate creases with patient hands. The guard, in turn, showed Harada how to play a simple tune on a harmonica. "You're a fast learner," he said, smiling. "No," Harada replied. "I just remember what it feels like to listen." The words hung between them, awkward, sincere, heavy with meaning neither could explain. It was in these small exchanges that the boundaries dissolved. The men no longer flinched when guards approached. They shared cigarettes, passed tools, even traded jokes that needed no translation. The camp, once defined by separation, began to feel like a small, improbable community. Yet with the comfort came a new kind of fear. What would happen when they returned home? The thought haunted Harada as he lay awake, listening to the crackle of the stove. Would Japan call them cowards for surviving? Would their families, if still alive, recognize them after the things they had seen? Worse, would they believe the stories, the meals, the music, the kindness? Survival itself had become its own quiet shame, a scar invisible but deep. He imagined stepping off a ship into a ruined harbor, the air thick with suspicion. No one would welcome them as soldiers. They would be ghosts, men who had lived when others had died with honor. Still, winter forced them to stay present. The work was lighter now, mostly mending fences, clearing paths, or tending the livestock. Harada found a strange satisfaction in these tasks. To mend something broken, to give structure to the cold, felt like a form of redemption. The guards worked beside them without supervision, their rifles slung loosely or left leaning against posts. Trust, once unthinkable, had taken root quietly beneath the snow. On Christmas Day the guards surprised them again. They opened the gates to the yard and lit a small fire. Coffee was brewed, and a record player was brought out, its tinny sound carrying across the cold air. The prisoners gathered hesitantly, forming a circle around the flames. Someone handed Harada a harmonica, urging him to play. He did, fumbling at first, then finding the melody of a tune he had heard from the Americans weeks before. It was soft and wavering, but it made the guards smile. One even clapped along. For a fleeting moment, the war, the propaganda, the guilt, all of it seemed to dissolve into the smoke that rose toward the starlit sky. The men laughed, clapped, and sang until their voices grew hoarse. They were still prisoners, yes, but in that fragile space between snow and firelight, they felt freer than they ever had under the flag of the Empire. When the fire died and the cold crept back in, Harada returned to his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The faint sound of the record still played in his memory. He thought of home, of faces blurred by time and distance, and he wondered if they would ever understand this strange peace he had found among strangers. The snow outside gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and in its quiet stillness he realized the truth he could never write in a letter. That captivity, in its paradox, had taught him more about freedom than war ever could. When the orders came in early spring, they arrived like a whisper of finality carried on the thawing wind. The war was over, truly over, and the prisoners were going home. Men who had grown used to the rhythm of Kansas fields suddenly found themselves packing the few possessions they owned: a spare shirt, a folded note, a paper crane. Harada kept something else, a small hand-folded paper turkey given to him by the farmer's daughter on the last day of harvest. "For luck," she had said, pressing it into his palm. He had not known how to answer, so he only bowed. Now he tucked it carefully into his coat pocket as if it were made of glass. The journey back across the Pacific felt longer than the voyage that had brought them to America. The ship's hold smelled of salt and iron, but it carried something heavier, the weight of what waited beyond the horizon. The men stood on deck for hours, watching the gray line of their homeland grow clearer. They imagined what they would find, but none of them were prepared for the truth. Japan, once a land of order and pride, had become a graveyard of cities. Smoke still drifted from ruins. Villages were gutted, bridges gone, people wandering like ghosts through the rubble. The men who stepped off that ship were not welcomed as heroes, but as reminders of a war that had devoured everything and returned nothing. Harada's village no longer existed as he remembered it. The houses were charred husks, their gardens choked with weeds. His mother's home was gone, only the foundation remained. A neighbor, gray and hollow-eyed, told him she had died the previous winter. "She waited for you," the man said, "but we had no food." Harada bowed low, unable to speak. In his coat pocket, the paper turkey pressed against his heart, fragile proof of a kindness no one here would believe. At night, in what was left of the local temple, former soldiers gathered around small fires, trading rumors of survival. Some spoke bitterly of their time in captivity, inventing cruelty to mask the shame of being fed by the enemy. Others stayed silent, afraid of being branded traitors if they told the truth. Harada listened, his jaw clenched, as one man sneered, "They made us eat their food, sing their songs. Better to have died than live as their pets." The others nodded grimly. Harada said nothing. How could he explain that it was in that foreign field, not the battlefield, where he had rediscovered what it meant to be human? Words could not survive in soil still poisoned by pride. In the weeks that followed, Harada tried to rebuild what he could. He helped clear rubble, traded labor for rice, and slept beneath the open sky. Sometimes, when he was alone, he unfolded the paper turkey and stared at its creases, now worn soft from his touch. It was absurd, he knew, a childish thing, fragile and meaningless amid such devastation. Yet when he looked at it, he could still smell the Kansas wind, still hear the laughter of guards who had become friends, still taste the food that had once filled him with both shame and gratitude. He wondered if those men remembered him too. When people asked about his imprisonment, he lied. "It was harsh," he would say, "but I survived." It was easier that way. The truth would only confuse them. To admit that the enemy had shown mercy was to betray every dead comrade, every burned village, every lie that had kept them fighting. So he carried the truth in silence, hidden like the paper bird in his pocket. Years passed, and Japan began to rise again from the ashes. Yet Harada remained marked by something invisible, a memory that did not fit the narrative of victory or defeat. Sometimes he would walk to the harbor at dusk, watching ships leave for the horizon. In the distance, gulls wheeled and cried, their wings catching the light. He would reach into his pocket, feel the crumpled folds of the paper turkey, and whisper the word he had once learned from an American boy in a field of wheat. "Thank you." No one ever heard him, but in that moment, he did not need them to. The gratitude was its own kind of prayer, a quiet act of remembrance for a world that had taught him mercy even when he thought himself undeserving of it. Decades passed, like pages turned by an unseen hand. The war that had once consumed the world became history, then memory, then myth. In a small home overlooking the sea, Harada sat by the window, his hands trembling as he poured tea into chipped cups. His grandchildren sat cross-legged on the tatami floor, notebooks open, asking questions for a school project about the war. They wanted stories of battle, of bravery, of the empire their textbooks had softened into nostalgia. But Harada only smiled faintly, the lines on his face deepening like the ridges of a worn map. "There are many kinds of battles," he said. "Not all of them are fought with guns." He paused, the steam from his cup curling upward, carrying the faint scent of roasted barley. The boy asked, "Did you ever meet the Americans?" Harada's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sea met the pale winter sky. "Yes," he whispered, "and they fed us." The children exchanged puzzled looks. "Fed you?" one repeated. Harada nodded slowly. "Turkey," he said, "and something called pumpkin pie." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "They gave us food," he continued after a moment, "but what they really gave us was something larger, the idea that mercy could survive war." The room went quiet. The children leaned closer, their pens forgotten. Outside, the scent of rice and miso drifted from a neighbor's kitchen, grounding the moment in the familiar. But in Harada's mind, the years fell away. He was once again that young man sitting at a wooden table in Kansas, holding a fork he didn't know how to use, tasting warmth for the first time in captivity. The flavor had faded long ago, yet the feeling had not, the disorienting sweetness of compassion. He told them of snow on the barracks roof, of the guards who smiled instead of shouted, of farmers who shared bread when they could have shared scorn. His grandchildren listened, wide-eyed, the way children do when a truth reshapes their understanding of the world. "Weren't you angry?" the youngest asked softly. Harada thought for a long time before answering. "I was," he said, "at first, because kindness makes you see the world differently, and once you see, you can never go back." As the afternoon light dimmed, he reached into the old wooden chest beside him. From within he pulled a small yellowed envelope, its edges frayed by decades of touch. Inside was the paper turkey, still intact despite time's cruelty. The children gasped as he unfolded it carefully, the creases soft but strong. "A gift," he said, "from a little girl who never knew my name." He placed it on the table, the paper wings trembling slightly in the draft from the window. "This," he said, "is what peace looks like, fragile, ordinary, and still here." He watched his grandchildren stare at the paper bird as though it were a relic from another world. Perhaps it was. In its folds lay the proof that compassion could bridge the distance between enemies, that humanity could bloom even in the cold soil of war. The boy reached out but stopped short of touching it, as if afraid the memory might crumble. Harada smiled. "You can touch it," he said. "It's stronger than it looks." Night fell, and the sea outside turned to ink. The children left soon after, their laughter fading down the path. Alone again, Harada sat listening to the wind rattle the shutters. He closed his eyes, and the years dissolved once more into that golden Kansas afternoon, the clatter of trays, the warmth of food, the quiet murmur of guards and prisoners sharing a table. In that moment he understood that mercy had not died with the war. It had endured in every act of kindness, in every story passed down, in every memory that refused to fade. And though his hands trembled now, the taste of that Thanksgiving, its impossible sweetness, its quiet power, remained. For the truest victories, he realized, were not won on battlefields or in history books, but at dinner tables where strangers chose to be human again.